morning. Happy Sabbath. It is a delight for me to see you today. How many of you had someone, somewhere, somehow involved in VBS this week? That's a bunch of you. Fantastic. Well, as you know already, the kids learned some fantastic things, and apparently they made some fantastic crafts as well. At least the lantern, anyway. But I know my daughter came home with some other crafts, and she was pretty excited about that. So, really exciting week where we talked about Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and a new friend that they made, a friend named Nebuchadnezzar. And so this morning what we're going to do is take a look in the message at Daniel and the tyrant's transformation. How did Daniel's life and the lives of his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or as we frequently refer to them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how did their lives transform the life of a tyrant, a man by the name of Nebuchadnezzar? So we're going to take a little journey through the book of Daniel this morning. I'll invite you to pull your Bibles out, and you can turn to Daniel chapter 1 if you want to get a head start on where we're going to be going. If you don't happen to have a Bible with you, you're welcome to pull out whatever electronic device you happen to have, your digital version. Some of us have the old-fashioned paper and ink versions, but you're welcome to use whatever you would like. And we're going to spend a little bit of time today in the book of Daniel learning about his life, and perhaps along the way learning just a little bit about our lives as well. So I'm going to invite you to join me in prayer as we begin this morning's message. Father, I want to thank you for drawing us together here today on a beautiful, beautiful Sabbath day and giving us an opportunity to learn more about what happened in Daniel's life and how you were able to use him to reach somebody who I think we would all agree was a pretty terrible person. But we also ask that as we look at these stories, you would help us learn how perhaps we might be able to reach someone as well. And we thank you in Jesus' name, amen. The year is 612 BC. That is 612 years before Christ. The place? The Fertile Crescent, part of which is called Mesopotamia. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with that part of the world, I'm going to draw an imaginary map up here on the platform. I want you to imagine the Middle East. Over here we have the Mediterranean Sea. Down here we have Africa, and right at the top is the country of Egypt. Here we have Jerusalem. Going north along the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, we have Syria, and then over to the right, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, we have the country back then called Babylon. Today, we would call it Iraq. So that's the area of the world that we are talking about. In 612 BC, the cruel Assyrian Empire was grinding its way to a close after ruling for about 300 years. And a brand new empire was coming up out of the ruins of the Assyrian Empire. The king of this new empire was a man by the name of Nabopolassar. And Nabopolassar was the king of Babylon. He finally crushed what was left of the Assyrian Empire, and he began to build his own empire. His son was a man by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. How many of you who were here at VBS this week remember a little something about Nebuchadnezzar? So that was Nebuchadnezzar, and his dad's name was Nabopolassar. Don't you just wish they would have named him like Bob and Sam? I mean, we're trying to keep track of Nabopolassar, and I can't even keep track of them straight. And fortunately, we've got names like Daniel. That makes it a little bit easier. But Nabopolassar and his son Nebuchadnezzar were growing the new Babylonian Empire, and while Nabopolassar did a good job of getting it started, it was his son, Nebuchadnezzar, who really brought the kingdom of Babylon into its golden age. But he didn't do that by being nice to everybody else. He did that by invading and conquering other kingdoms, subduing them, as it were. And he managed to grow Babylon through warfare, bloodshed, conquest, and expansion. In theological terms, we would call Nebuchadnezzar a bad dude. That's what he was. He liked to conquer. He liked to bring other empires and kingdoms underneath his own yoke, as it were. Nebuchadnezzar made 3 trips to Jerusalem. How many trips? 3 trips. And each time he went to Jerusalem, he inflicted a stricter punishment each and every time. On his very first visit that took place in 605 BC, he carried off many of the precious utensils that had been kept in Solomon's temple there in Jerusalem. He took them back with him to Babylon, but not only did he take many of those precious utensils, he also took some of the most promising, brightest, healthiest, smartest young people from Jerusalem back to Babylon to serve as his, well, you might say slaves, kind of advisors. He wanted to re-educate them, get them to turn away from the God of their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents and begin to serve his own gods. That was his first trip. The second trip he took in 597 BC, and he was pleased when the king then, that is the king of Judah, King Jehoiachin, not to be confused with King Jehoiakim. Here we go with confusing names again, right? He was pleased when King Jehoiachin gave up his rebellion and surrendered to him. But he wanted to make sure that Jehoiachin and the remaining Israelites kept in line. And so he took even more of the utensils from Solomon's temple, and he took 10,000 captives back with him to Babylon. That was his which trip? Second trip. How many trips did he make? 3 trips. On his third trip, after a serious revolt by Judah's king Zedekiah, you're counting these kings in Judah? Nebuchadnezzar returned to Jerusalem for a third visit in 586 BC, and at the conclusion of an extended siege, he leveled the city to the ground, including the temple. He said, I'm sick and tired of these rebellions. I'm sick and tired of these Israelites. I'm going to utterly and completely destroy their city. I'm going to take everybody captive and take them back to Babylon. The only ones that I'm going to leave here in Jerusalem are the poorest of the poor. I don't even want them. Everybody else comes back with me as a captive. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. I want to go back and pick this story up with the life of Daniel, with the book of Daniel. The kingdom of Judah, Daniel's homeland, realized that Babylon was growing in power and strength, and they wanted to protect themselves from this new and growing empire. And so they thought, the best thing that we can do is ally ourselves with another kingdom, another empire that might be able to protect us. And they looked down to the south. Here they were in Jerusalem. They looked down to the south and they saw another country, another nation down here, a nation called Egypt. Now, how many of you have heard at some point in your life that Egypt was a powerful kingdom and a powerful nation? You know what? That's what the Israelites thought too. They said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make a treaty with the Egyptians, and if we do that, then if the Babylonians come to invade us, the Egyptians will take care of us. Sounds like a great idea. And so they did. They made a treaty with the Egyptians. And the Babylonians said, really? You think that's going to help you, do you? Well, we're going to fix your misguided ideas. And so Nabopolassar, who wasn't really feeling up to leading an army at that particular time, called his son, Nebuchadnezzar, and he said, here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to take an army and go down to Jerusalem and see if you can get these guys in line." And Nebuchadnezzar smiled and said, "Happy to, Dad." And he took an army from Babylon, and he marched them up through the Fertile Crescent, down through Syria, along the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, and down to Jerusalem. And when he got to Jerusalem, he was not there for a friendly visit. He was there to get the Israelites in line and to help them understand who was boss. So he said to the king, Jehoiakim, he said, "Listen, I've heard that you've made a treaty with the Egyptians. I would like you to rethink that treaty and consider making a treaty with us. And if you're not sure whether that's a good idea or not, I'd like you to notice the army behind me." And Jehoiakim said, "I think I could make a treaty with you." And Nebuchadnezzar said, "That's great. I'm so glad to hear that. And just to make sure that you keep your end of the treaty, I'm going to go into your temple. I'm going to steal a bunch of the wealth that's in the temple, all those utensils, and I'm going to take your smartest and brightest and most promising young men back with me to Babylon. So behave yourself." And Jehoiakim said, "Okay." And Nebuchadnezzar left. Now, why did he leave? He didn't have to leave. He wasn't planning on leaving so quickly, but there was a reason that he did. And that's because just after he conquered Jerusalem, a messenger arrived from home. The messenger had bad news. The bad news was his father, Nabopolassar, had died. Now, I'm sure Nebuchadnezzar was probably a little bit upset that his father had died. But he wasn't nearly as upset about the fact that his father had died as the fact that it had taken the messenger 10 days to get from Babylon across the desert to Jerusalem with the news that his father had died. That meant his father died 10 days ago. Who did that leave sitting on the throne in Babylon? Nobody. Who do you think wanted to be sitting on the throne in Babylon? Nebuchadnezzar did. And so he said, "I need to get back home as quick as possible because I don't want anybody else taking that kingdom from me. That kingdom is mine." And so he took a small group of people, and instead of traveling along the Fertile Crescent to get back home, do you know what there is in the middle of that Fertile Crescent? You know what's there? Desert. Desert. That's not a safe place to cross. But his kingdom was in peril. And so he said, "I'm not going to go back along the Fertile Crescent. I'm going to cut right across the desert." And so he and a small group of people rode as fast as they could across the desert. They covered about 50 miles a day, which is not bad for crossing the desert on horses or camels or however they got across. And in about 13 days, he made it back to Babylon and found that no one had taken the kingdom from him. Now the kingdom of Babylon was his. But what about Daniel and the other captives? He can't take all those captives across in 13 days. So he left a larger group of people, his soldiers, with the captives to march them up along the Fertile Crescent and back home again. A journey by foot that would take about 2 months. How many of you have ever walked for 2 months straight? Right? That's what Daniel did. He didn't do it by choice. He didn't have an opportunity to choose. But Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as prisoners of Babylon, walked for 2 months straight until they finally reached the kingdom of Babylon. And that's where we pick up the book of Daniel in Daniel chapter 1. So I'm going to invite you to turn to Daniel chapter 1, and we're going to take a look here at this incredible story of Daniel and how he reaches others for Jesus. In Daniel chapter 1, verse number 1, it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God." In addition to those things that he brought home, as I mentioned, he took home a bunch of captives. Well, what did he do with Daniel and his friends? He wanted to re-educate them. He wanted to retrain them. He saw some value, some benefit in them, and he said, if I could use them to serve me, well, that'd be fantastic. And so he gave them the opportunity to enroll in the Babylonian university system. He says, I'm going to provide you guys free education. I'm going to provide you with free food. I'm going to give you the best clothes. And as a result of that, I want you to serve me and make me more powerful than I am. Now, if you've been coming to VBS, you know a little bit of the story of what happens in Daniel chapter 1. Look at verse 5. It says, "And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might do" what? Stand before the king. He says, I'm going to give you a free education, free food, free board, free everything, and in 3 years you'll be ready to stand before me and be one of my advisors. Well, Daniel knew a little something about what was right and what was wrong. And he looked at that food that was provided for him and he said, I don't know that I can eat this stuff. I don't know that I can drink this stuff. It's not good for my body. It's not good for my mind. Look at verse 8. It says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not" what? "Defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself." So he said, I don't think I can, in good conscience, eat this food and drink this beverage, so I need to find some other way to deal with this. I'm not willing to compromise my beliefs as a believer in the God of heaven, who wants to take care of my body, who wants me to take care of my body. So then we drop down to verse number 12. Actually, I want to look at verse 10 real quick. You know what? I hate skipping Bible verses. Let's just look at verse 9. Verse 9 says, "Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs." In other words, he made a good impression on this guy who was taking care of him. "And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king." Wait, who's his lord the king? Nebuchadnezzar. Do you think this prince of the eunuchs had any reason to fear Nebuchadnezzar? Yes, he did. He says, "I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then you shall make me endanger my head to the king." So Daniel tells this guy, he says, listen, I don't want to eat this food and drink this drink. I want something different, something that's a little bit healthier. And the prince of the eunuchs says, listen, if you come out of this eating your own diet and you're not as strong and as healthy looking as the others that I'm feeding this food to, whose head goes on the chopping block? His mine does. I'm concerned because I know Nebuchadnezzar is, what was that theological term we used a little bit ago? He's a bad dude, right? He says, I'm a little bit concerned about this guy. I don't want to endanger my head to the king. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. What does he say in verse 12? He says, prove thy servants. In other words, test us. I beseech you, I ask you, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Now, some of you who have a little more modern translation of the Bible, mine's really old, it's a King James. What does it say instead of pulse? Vegetables. He says, let them give us give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances or our faces be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat. And as thou seest, deal with thy servant. So give us 10 days on this diet of vegetables and water, and then check us out. Look at our faces. Look at our constitution. See how we're doing and compare us with everybody else. And then he says, and whatever you think, then deal with your servants. So he consented to them in this matter and proved them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their countenances, their faces, appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. So by the end of 10 days, on this new diet that they had requested, it says their faces looked fairer and fatter in flesh than everybody else who was eating what had been provided. Now, some of you are thinking right now, then I don't want to eat that stuff because my face is fat enough as it is, right? So if I could steer clear of that, I would be much happier. But remember where they had just come from. They had just marched along the what? The Fertile Crescent. For how long? For 2 months. They had walked for 2 months. What do you think their bodies looked like? They were exhausted, they were worn out, they were thin, they were emaciated, they were tired, they were worn out. And on this diet that Daniel requested, they regained their strength and their vigor and their muscle, and their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than everybody else. Now, how many of you think that sounds like a little bit better diet now? All right? So they regained their strength. And not only that, it says in verse 17 that these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel also had understanding in all what? Visions and dreams. So part of the benefit of Daniel following the guidelines, the counsel that he had been given from God, that his parents no doubt had passed on down to him, was that he was able to now understand things better as well. Not just physical benefits, but also mental and spiritual benefits from following the guidelines that God had given. Now at the end of 10 days, verse 18, that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And I want you to notice what happens here in verse 19. Here is Daniel's, we'll call it introduction. I don't know a better word to use. Daniel's introduction to Nebuchadnezzar at the end of Daniel chapter 1. It says, and the king communed with them. What does the word commune mean? Talk, visit, connect, spend time. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like who? Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. Keep those magicians and astrologers in your mind. We're going to come back to them in just a moment or two. But it says he found them 10 times better. Now, how many of you at your place of work, where you are employed, and if you happen to be employed in the home, that counts too, how many of you feel that you do a decent job at work? At least a decent job. What are the rest of you doing at work? Because I'm no good at work at all. I don't know why they give me a paycheck. No clue whatsoever. I'm going to assume you do a decent job at work. Now, what if you did 10 times better at work than you do today? How many of you think you might be up for, at the very least, a raise? Okay? Or a promotion or something. They did 10 times better. Do you think that caught Nebuchadnezzar's attention, yes or no? Yes, it did. Let's move on to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel 2. We're looking at this relationship between Daniel and a tyrant. The tyrant has introduced to them in Daniel chapter 1, and now we begin to see some changes. They're 10 times smarter than everybody else in their class. It says in verse number 1, chapter 2, verse number 1. And in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, what year of his reign? Second. So this is still early on. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams wherewith his spirit was troubled and his sleep brake from him. In other words, he woke up. How many of you have ever had a dream, a vivid dream, a powerful dream, so powerful, so vivid, that right in the middle of your dream you woke up? Any of you ever done that before? That's not uncommon. That's what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. Then it says in verse 2, notice what he does. Then the king commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans. Remember those astrologers and magicians from the last chapter we just talked about? He calls them in for to show the king his dream. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I've dreamed a dream and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. He says, I had this dream and I'm trying to figure out what it means, but it's bothering me, it's troubling me. My spirit was troubled to know the dream. And then spoke the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Now, whenever you see the word O used in the Bible, when it's addressing somebody, O king or O Nebuchadnezzar or O Daniel or O whatever, O is a sign of great respect. O king, they say. O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will we will show the interpretation. That's not hard to do, is it? If you had a dream and you came to me and you said, Eric, here's my dream, what does it mean? Do you think I could come up with an interpretation? Sure I could. Wouldn't be right, but I could come up with one. You had a dream about a pineapple and a broomstick and an old horse. So, here's what that means. It means you're a great person. No, it doesn't mean that at all. It means I'm just making stuff up to make you happy. That's what that means. And that's exactly what these so-called wise men had been doing for Nebuchadnezzar for years. But they say, just tell your servants the dream, and we will tell you the interpretation. The king answered, verse 5, and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. In other words, I don't remember what it was. But if you will not make known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. That's very poetic. Here's what Nebuchadnezzar is actually saying. We'll bring it into 2023 language. Nebuchadnezzar says, listen, I've been paying you boys well, and I expect you to deliver. You either tell me what I dreamed last night and interpret it for me, or here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to cut off your arms, and I'm going to cut off your legs, and I'm going to cut off your head, and I'm going to chop you up into little bitty pieces, and I'm going to turn your house into a sewage treatment plant. Today we would call Nebuchadnezzar a motivational speaker. How many of you would have been motivated by that? Right? They were motivated. They realized that their lives were on the line. So he says, you do that, but if you show me the dream, verse 6, and the interpretation, you will receive from me great gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and the interpretation thereof. They answered again and said, let the king tell the servants the dream, and we'll just tell us what it was. That's all you got to do, king. Just tell us what it was, and we've got it from there. We can handle the rest of it. We just need to know what it was. He said, but if you will not make known to me the dream, there is but one decree for you. For you have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me till the time be changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I will know that you can show me the interpretation. The Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore there is no king, lord, nor ruler that asks such a thing of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. Verse 12 says, the king was angry and very furious, and he commanded to destroy how many of the wise men of Babylon? all of them. He said, I've had it with you. You're taking advantage of me, and I know it. And so I'm going to deal with you the way I know how to deal with people who give me problems. I'm going to kill you. And so he sends out a decree that all the wise men in Babylon are to be destroyed. And the decree goes forth. You can read it down in verses 13, 14, 15, and so forth. The guards go out to gather up all the wise men in Babylon and to kill them. Now, something interesting has happened since Daniel chapter 1. In Daniel chapter 1, Daniel was this student in the Babylonian university system. But we found at the end of Daniel chapter 1 that he was now how many times wiser? 10 times wiser. So evidently the king has now added him to his list of wise men, which would make sense because he's how many times wiser? 10 times wiser. Now, for one reason or another, Daniel and his friends were not there at the original consultation at the king's bedside. But he was still a wise man. And the king commanded that how many wise men were to be executed? All of them. And so the captain of the king's guard comes to Daniel's house where he lives with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he knocks on the door. And Daniel opens up the door and he says, "May I help you?" And the king's guard says, "Yes, actually, I'm here to kill you." And Daniel says, "Hang on, time out, wait a second. What's going on? Let me talk to the king." So he goes and talks to the king. And he asks the king to give him a little bit of time. What do you think Daniel wanted time to do? What would you want time to do? You'd want time to pray, right? And so Daniel says, "Give me a minute. Let me go pray. I'm going to go home to my friends, to my buddies, and we're going to pray, and let us come back tomorrow and tell you what happened." So he goes home and he prays. And he and his friends have a very intense prayer session. Now, this is not like a, "Dear Lord, you're a great guy, and today went really well, and I'm glad the weather was nice, and thanks for good food we had today." It was not with some rambling, wandering, flowery prayer. If your neck was on the line, do you think you'd be pretty serious in your prayer? You know Daniel was, and you know his friends were. Now, prayer for Daniel was not just something that he did in times of emergency. Prayer was very habitual for Daniel. In fact, you learned a little something about how Daniel's prayer life got him in trouble this week, didn't you? It got him thrown into the lion's den, right? Because Daniel was such a regular prayer. He prayed regularly. He did that too. He prayed regularly. And so when this crisis came, Daniel said, "Time to pray again, just like I always do. Lord, I'm in a fix here. Nothing I can do to get myself out of it, but you're the God of heaven, and I know that you can do it. In fact, I know that you gave that dream to Nebuchadnezzar. I'd appreciate it if you would give it to me too, along with the interpretation." God said, "Happy to." And that night he gave Daniel the very same dream that he had given Nebuchadnezzar the night before. So the next day, Daniel goes to Nebuchadnezzar, and let's pick this up in verse 19 says, "Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven." Let's drop down now to verse number 25. Verse 24. "Therefore Daniel went in unto Arioch, whom the king had ordained to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus unto him, Destroy not the wise men of Babylon." Wait a minute, hang on. Did you just catch that? What did Daniel tell the king's guard not to do? Don't destroy the wise men of Babylon. Wouldn't it have been tempting for him to say, "Go ahead and kill them. Just save me and my friends alive"? Wouldn't that have been tempting? Yeah, he says, no, don't kill any of them. Don't kill any of them. Then what does he say? He went and said thus unto him, Destroy not the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show unto the king the interpretation. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste and said thus unto him, I have found a man of the captives of Judah that will make known unto the king the interpretation. I love that. Arioch comes in, he says, hey, guess what I found? Who you think he's trying to get on the good side of? The king, right? Did he do anything? No, nothing at all. He's just going out trying to kill people, and Daniel says, hang on, let me talk to the king. Then Daniel comes back, hey, I've got the answer, take me to the king, and Arioch's like, that's what I found. Any of you know anybody like that, tries to take all the credit? That's what Arioch was doing. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, that was his Babylonian name. One of the other gifts that Nebuchadnezzar gave to all of the captives of the Israelites was he gave them new names. He says, oh, your name is Daniel? Oh, that connects you to your God? Let me give you a new name that will connect you to my God. Oh, your name's Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah? Those connect you to your gods? Let me give you some new names. Your names are now Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They all connect to his gods. Art thou able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen and the interpretation thereof? Look at verse 27. I love verse 27. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded, cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king? Can't they tell you what your dream was, king? They're your wise men. Can't they deliver? The answer, of course, is what? No, they can't. They're not connected with the God of heaven. They're no good whatsoever. And Daniel he brings that to the front. But then look where Daniel gives the credit. He says, but there is a what? God in heaven that revealeth secrets and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. He says, God has shown me what the dream was. And God has given me the interpretation. What God is showing you is the future. And then over the course of the next 8-10 verses, Daniel gives the exact dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. If you want to know what that looked like, step out into the foyer before you leave. That huge statue out there. Now, I don't think the one that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about was filled with air from a fan. But you get the idea. Let me check your memory. The head was made of gold. Ooh, you're doing well so far. Chest and arms of silver. Belly and thighs of brass or bronze. Legs of iron, and feet made of iron and clay. And then something else happened. The Bible says that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands. And what did that stone do? Struck the image on its feet and became a great mountain, and it filled the whole earth. So Daniel tells the king all these things in the next few verses here. And what do you think the look on Nebuchadnezzar's face was like as Daniel is recounting this whole thing to him? What do you think his face looked like? Eyes big as saucers, right? Jaw on the floor. He's leaning out of his chair, and he's going, that's it? That's what I dreamed the other night? How'd you know that? That's exactly what I dreamed. What do you think the next question out of Nebuchadnezzar's mouth would have been? What's it mean? You just told me what it was, now tell me, what does it mean? And Daniel begins to tell him what these different things mean. Look at verse number 38. In verse number 38, verse 37. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given thee a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven have been given unto your hand, and have made thee ruler over all. Thou art this head of gold. He says, Nebuchadnezzar, your kingdom of Babylon, you're the head of gold. How do you think that made Nebuchadnezzar feel? Hey, I like this, right? I'm the head of gold, and the kingdom of Babylon is the head of gold. I'm liking this so far. But then Daniel had a little bit of bad news to give. He said then, what does he say in verse number 39? And after thee shall arise another what? Kingdom inferior to thee. And another third kingdom of brass which will bear, and then iron, and then the feet of iron and clay. So he says, after you there's another kingdom coming. Now that in Nebuchadnezzar's mind might have been a little bit of bad news, right? He liked the whole head of gold thing, not so much a fan of the rest of it. But Daniel goes ahead and gives it anyway. And then he says something very interesting. Look at verse 45. Basically, each of those metals represented a different kingdom. You've studied them if you came to VBS: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, the divided nations of Europe. For as much as you saw, verse 45, that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. The dream is what? Certain, and the interpretation thereof is what? Is sure. What does that stone represent? Do you remember? That represents Christ and his eternal kingdom that will one day take the place of all these earthly kingdoms. And then Daniel says the dream is certain and the interpretation thereof is sure. Now I want you to notice verse 47. Verse 47 says, the king answered unto Daniel and said, of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret. He says, Daniel, your God, he's a different God than the gods that I worship, but your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings. Now, does he say your God is the God? No. He says your God is a God. So Nebuchadnezzar is making progress here. He's willing to recognize Daniel's God as a God. He's not converted, but he's making progress. And as a result of that, what happens? It says the king made Daniel a great man, gave him many great gifts, made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel requested of the king that he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, his friends, over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. So Daniel's making progress with Nebuchadnezzar. Look at Daniel chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. This is interesting. Nebuchadnezzar makes a statue now. And it says that he makes this statue out of what? Gold. Why would Nebuchadnezzar make this statue out of one metal, and that metal is gold? What's he thinking about? He's thinking about that dream from Daniel chapter 2. Remember the dream that had the head of gold, and gold represented the kingdom of Babylon. Now Nebuchadnezzar builds a statue, and it says it's 60 cubits high. That's about 90 feet high. You put a base on it, it's about 30 feet. You're looking at a 120-foot tall image made of gold from head to toe. What message do you think Nebuchadnezzar is trying to send to people about his kingdom and how long it's going to last? He said, my kingdom of Babylon, it's going to last forever. Not just a head of gold. From head to toe, 120 foot tall, the kingdom of Babylon will last forever. That was his desire. And he sets it up in the plain of Dura, a very broad, flat plain over there near Baghdad, Iraq. Then Nebuchadnezzar sends out a message. He sends a royal invitation to all of the influential people in Babylon to invite them to the dedication of this image. Now, why did he do that? I'll give you a little historical background here. There are about 8 to 9 years that pass between Daniel 2 and Daniel 3. And during those 8 to 9 years, there was a rebellion in Nebuchadnezzar's army, an attempted coup. They tried to overthrow Nebuchadnezzar. So when that coup was taking place, when his army or parts of his army were rebelling against him, what do you think was going through his mind with respect to Daniel chapter 2? Head of gold, chest and arms of silver. In Nebuchadnezzar's mind, he's thinking, man, is this when that next kingdom is going to come up? Are these the people who are going to overthrow me, or at least attempt to? I don't think that's going to happen. And historical documents have been found describing this mutiny and how Nebuchadnezzar dealt with the mutineers. Now, I'm going to let you guess. based on what you know of Nebuchadnezzar up to this point and the fact that he is a bad dude, how do you think he dealt with the mutineers in his army? He killed them. He says, don't you try to do that. And don't anybody else get any bad ideas, or what happened to them is going to happen to you. But he was a smart guy, Nebuchadnezzar was. And he realized that he probably hadn't got all of the mutineers. So he said, I'm gonna have a party. And I'm going to invite all the influential people to this party. And I'm going to build an image of gold that's all about me. And in this party, I'm going to strike up the band. And everybody at the party is going to have to bow down and worship this great big image that's all about me. And if somebody doesn't bow down, I'll know that they're not on my side. And what am I going to do? Kill them, right? That's his solution to so many problems, right? Just kill the people who disagree with you. Problem solved, right? So in verse number 4, a herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. When the music plays, fall down and worship. And if you don't, I'm going to throw you into this furnace over here. Now you may be thinking, a furnace is a very strange thing to have at a party. I mean, unless you go to different parties than I've been to, right? What's the furnace there for? Well, think about it for a moment. He had just made a 120-foot tall image made of gold. What do you think they needed to do to the gold in order to turn it into the image? They needed to melt it. So he had this furnace here to melt the gold to make the image, which was rather convenient for the dedication of the image, wasn't it? He says, it's already here. We might as well use it. And so the furnace is roaring, and the band begins to play. And everybody bows down to the image except for 3 people. What were their names? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They don't bow down. Why not? Very easy. Because God said in the second commandment, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, the likeness of anything in heaven above, or the earth beneath, or the waters under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers unto the children of the 3rd and 4th generation. God said, don't bow down to and worship images. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, that makes pretty clear sense, so we're not going to do it. But the Bible says that there were some Chaldeans that were in the audience. Who are these Chaldeans? Have we met them before? Yeah, they're the ones in Daniel chapter 1 who didn't end up 10 times wiser. They're the ones in Daniel chapter 2 who the king called and they failed. So by the time we get to Daniel chapter 3, these guys are smarting. They're not happy about these Jews. So when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't bow down, they go running to the king. They say, King, King, there are 3 guys who didn't bow down. Now wait a second. The command was, when the music plays, everybody is supposed to bow down. And these Chaldeans come up, running up and saying, King, King, they didn't bow down. How did they know they didn't bow down? They're peeking, man. But they see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They go running up. And the king he's understandably upset. So he tells Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I'm going to give you a second chance. I'm going to give you a second chance. Maybe you didn't hear the music. Maybe you didn't understand the command. I'll give you a second chance. I'm going to play the music again, and you better bow down. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say something interesting. They say, we are not careful, O king, we are not careful to answer you in this matter. In other words, O king, will give you respect, but we don't have to think twice about this. You can give us the second chance. We appreciate it. We're grateful. But we're still not going to bow down, even if you give us the second chance. How do you think that made Nebuchadnezzar feel? He said, I want you to stoke that fire how many times hotter? 7 times hotter than it's regularly stoked. Tie him up hand and foot and throw him in. And he does. But then something interesting happens. In verse 22, therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The soldiers who bound them and threw them in, they died because of the heat of the fire. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished and rose up in haste and said to his counselors, did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, true, O king. Verse 25, he answered and said, lo, I see how many men loose? 4 men loose. I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Time out. This story is happening 600 years BC. That is 600 years before Christ. Let me put that a different way. This is happening 600 years before Jesus was born as a baby in Bethlehem. And Nebuchadnezzar looks in that fire and he says, the form of the 4th one, he looks like the Son of God. How does Nebuchadnezzar know what the Son of God looks like? You ever stop and think about that? But Nebuchadnezzar, he says it definitively. He looks like the Son of God. How does he know what the Son of God looks like? The answer is real simple. Because Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have been telling him about what their God is like. So when Nebuchadnezzar looks in that fire and he sees a 4th one in there, he's like, gotta be the Son of God. This is the one that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have been talking to me about. Got to be him. So what does Nebuchadnezzar tell him to do? He says, come out of the fire. What do? They come out. That's interesting. When he told them to bow down to the image, they disobeyed him. They said, nope, not doing it. We're not listening to you. No way, no how. Even if it costs us our life, we will not obey you. Now he says, hey, come out of the fire. And they're like, okay. And they come out. I'd have been hesitant. I'll be honest with you. I'm like, really? You want me to come out of the fire? Like 5 minutes ago, you threw me in the fire. You're trying to kill me. Fire didn't work, huh? So you want me to come out so you can try what? A sword, a spear? You want me to come out of the fire? Why don't you come on in and get me? See how that works. But they didn't do that. When he said come out, what did they do? They came out. Why did they come out? Why did they obey him then and disobey him 5 minutes earlier? Here's why, and it's significant. When Nebuchadnezzar commanded them to bow down and worship the image, that conflicted with a higher authority in their lives, and that is the God of heaven. The God of heaven said, don't bow down and worship images. Nebuchadnezzar said, bow down and worship images. They said, no, we're following God. His command conflicts with yours. We follow him. We're not even careful to answer you in this matter. We don't have to think about it. When Nebuchadnezzar says, hey, come out of the fire, was there any command of God that conflicted with that? Nope. No conflict whatsoever. So they said, okay, you're the king. Happy to do it. And out they came. And then it says, you read the end of the story here, it says that the fire did not burn them. Their hair was not singed. Not even was the smell of smoke upon them. You want to talk about a witness for God? All the influential people in the kingdom were there that day. What would have happened if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when the music began to play, had just kind of bent down and tied their sandals. Make it look good, right? They would have missed an opportunity, a massive opportunity to witness for God. So what happens at the end of this story? We look at the end of Daniel chapter 3, and it says in verses 28 and 29, "Then Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said, 'Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word and yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill.'" Okay, he's making progress, right? But he's still all into the cutting in pieces and houses of dunghills. Because there is, look at this, there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Where was he at the end of Daniel chapter 2? Your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings. We get to the end of Daniel chapter 3, and he says there is no other God who can deliver like that. And that gets us to Daniel chapter 4. And Daniel chapter 4 begins with some interesting words. "Nebuchadnezzar the king, unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you." Wait a minute. Daniel 1, 2, and 3 were written by who? Daniel. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, all written by Daniel. Daniel 4 is not written by Daniel. Who is Daniel 4 written by? Nebuchadnezzar? Nebuchadnezzar wrote a chapter of the Bible? This is the cut you in pieces and houses a dunghill guy, right? This is the kill 'em all guy. This is the, what's the theological term again? This is the bad dude. What's he doing writing a chapter of the Bible? He says, "I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God has wrought toward me. How great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation." I'm going to let you read this chapter for yourself, but I want to hit some high points here. He has another dream, and he wants it to be interpreted. Sounds like familiar territory, right? So who did he call in last time? All his wise men, his Chaldeans, his magicians, his astrologers, who do you think he calls in this time? Same people. Calls them back in. They're not able to help. But then Daniel comes in. And Daniel says, "What was that dream?" King tells him. Daniel says, "Here's what it means." And he walks him through it. He says, "Your pride is setting you up for a fall. And if you don't get your act straight, you're going to pay a heavy price. You're going to live like an animal out under the stars with the dew falling on you every night, your hair getting matted like feathers, your fingernails growing like birds' claws. You're going to lose your mind if you don't straighten up." Well, that got Nebuchadnezzar's attention. And for 12 months, he did exactly what he should have done. But then, look at verse 30. Verse 29. "At the end of 12 months, he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. And the king spoke and said, 'Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of my kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? Look at all I've done. Ain't I something?'" Actually, no, he's not. While the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is" what? "Departed from you, it is taken from you. And for 7 years he lives like a beast out in the field." And in verse 34, it says, "At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that lives forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom is from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand, or can say to him, What doest thou? And at that time my reason returned to me. And for the glory of my kingdom, my honor, my brightness returned to me, and my counselors and my lords sought unto me, and I was established in the kingdom, and excellent majesty was added unto me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar," verse 37, "praise and extol and honor the kingdom of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment. And those that walk in pride, he is able to" what? To humble or to abase. When you get to heaven, you can expect to see Nebuchadnezzar there. Why? Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego allowed God to use them to reach the people that they came in contact with, not the least of whom was the king of Babylon. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, man, then in the grand scheme of things, if in the end Nebuchadnezzar was converted, it sure was a good thing that Nebuchadnezzar was as bloodthirsty and proud and strong as he was, and his army was able to conquer Jerusalem so that he could bring back Daniel and his friends captive, so that then he would have an opportunity to be saved. But if you thought that, you missed something very significant. I want you to go back to Daniel 1, verse 2. Daniel 1, verse 2. In Daniel 1, verse 2, it says, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim," that's verse 1. Verse 2 says, "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand." Do you realize what you just read? It says, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. It wasn't because of the size of Nebuchadnezzar's army, the number of soldiers that he had, the number of chariots, the number of horses. Had nothing to do with that. It says, who gave him into his hand? God did. God gave the kingdom into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Why? Because God desired his people to be a light in the world. In Deuteronomy 32, verse 9, it tells us he wanted Israel to be his people. Not just bless the Israelites alone, but so that they could be a light to the Gentiles. He wanted them to witness to other nations about how good God was, how wonderful God was, how loving how God was, how just God was. That's what he wanted his children to do, and they didn't do it. In order to do that, they had to be faithful to him. They weren't. They weren't. Instead, God wasn't able to use the whole nation of Israel to do this, but he still had some faithful people who were willing to be used. You read about some of the things that the Israelites were involved in. Jeremiah 9, 17, 22. Dishonesty, injustice to the poor, murder, breaking the Sabbath, persecuting the prophets, favoring preachers who promised prosperity without condemning vice. They were involved in a variety of sexual preferences and a whole lot more. Sounds a little bit like today, doesn't it? There are two lessons that we can learn from today's message. Two lessons. I'm going to sum this up here. Daniel's character, and we could extend that to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as well, was faithful, consistent, and caring. He didn't compromise. He was faithful, consistent, and caring. He was unapologetic, but he was also gracious. That's the first lesson. Lesson number 2, Daniel actively shared his faith, and so did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They didn't just hope people would notice that they were nice. They gave credit where it was due. They said the God of heaven is the one who did this. They gave credit where it was due. Why is this important for us today? Because God wants us to reach others. He wants us to be faithful, consistent, caring people who are unapologetic, but also gracious. And he wants us to actively share our faith with others, just like Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel did. And we have an awesome opportunity, actually this October, to be able to do that. Because we're going to be, from right here, presenting a beautiful series of messages from the Bible to the community and inviting people to get to know Jesus personally as their Savior. Now, how are people going to hear about these? Oh, we'll do some advertising. We'll send out handbills. We'll do stuff on social media and probably television, radio, things like that. But you know how the vast majority of people are going to hear about these messages? From you. Because you're going to invite people. And it's going to change their lives forever. But only if you do it. It doesn't work if you think about doing it. If you promise to do it. If you want to do it. If you mean to do it. It only works if you do it. But that invitation begins today with interacting with people and sharing with them. But I want to encourage you with something as we kind of tie this off now. Back in Daniel chapter 2, we looked at that multi-metalled man. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, divided nations of Europe, the stone that comes down. I'll tell you a true story. Those of you who've heard me speak before, I know I like true stories. Back at the beginning of World War II, 1939, Hitler violated Poland's Danzig corridor. He invaded. And the world kind of went, that doesn't look good. But let's just see what happens. Well, things went from bad to worse. In 1940, he invaded France, and the English came to try to help. Didn't work quite as well as they would have liked. And there was an evacuation back across the English Channel. Any of you remember what that was called or where that happened? Dunkirk. How many of you have heard of Dunkirk? There was a movie just a few years ago about that. And Hitler and the Nazis were steamrolling across Europe. Country after country was falling. And it looked like no good thing was going to come out of this. And there was a magazine that was published here in the United States called Signs of the Times. It looked at current events and compared them with the Bible. And the editor of the magazine was a man by the name of Arthur S. Maxwell. And he was writing editorials in the magazine at that time saying how Hitler was not going to succeed and how Europe would not fall to the Nazis. And he wrote editorial after editorial. And there were a lot of Bible students who said, listen, hey, I don't know if you've been paying attention or not to what's actually going on over there, but Europe is falling. Hitler is winning, and you need to stop writing these articles. And he said, but Daniel 2 says he's not going to succeed. They said, yeah, but he's succeeding. Stop it. You're embarrassing everybody. He said, all right, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'll stop writing editorials about Hitler's eventual defeat. And instead, I'm going to dedicate an entire issue of the magazine to Hitler's defeat and the prophecy of Daniel chapter 2. And he did. The whole July 2nd, 1940 issue of Signs of the Times magazine is all about Daniel 2, and it's all about how Hitler would not succeed. That took guts. But it took even more guts to write in the magazine where he invited the readers to keep their magazine and hold on to it because they'd want it in the future to refer to. Well, I can tell you that at least one person took him up on his offer, because I have the July 2nd, 1940 issue of Signs of the Times in my hand. God's word doesn't fail. That's what you've been learning in VBS this week. God's word doesn't fail, and you can trust it. The world, it's going to turn to the left and right and everywhere in between. And it's tough to know what's right and wrong and which way's up and which way's down. But God's word will never fail you. Dare to be a Daniel. Dare to stand alone. If you do, God will bless you. How many of you want to ask God to help you?